Hear me? Oh boy. Okay. I'm Bryn Geffert. I'm the Dean of Libraries here at the University of Vermont, and I want to welcome you to today's panel on local democracy, civil information, and the role of a free press, a very apt topic in this tumultuous year of our Lord 2025. Today's panel takes as a given the proposition that healthy democracies rely on independent news organizations not only to inform the electorate and explain to citizens and decision makers alike the ways of government, but also, of course, to shine the light on bad practices and corruption and to establish baselines of verifiable truth. Vermont, of course, has long celebrated its commitment to civic engagement and touted its commitment to town meetings. But Vermonters, like the rest of the nation, are increasingly sorting themselves into less diverse, more insular digital spaces and shifting their media diets to more polarized national sources. How do these trends manifest in Vermont, and what are the implications for our local democracy? This is one of the many questions I'm assuming our local panel is going to touch on this afternoon. I'm thrilled that the libraries are hosting this event. This event serves in part as a kickoff to efforts by the library to better highlight and make available not only international and national, but also local news. You're going to hear word in the weeks ahead about an experimental news hub here in the Howe Library. But I'm also proud to host this event because teaching students to find and evaluate information is crucial to the library's mission. In fact, our mission statement commits us to teaching the craft of research, I'm quoting here, and equitably connecting people to knowledge. Both of these phrases, I think, signal a commitment to teaching and to information equity. So, let me introduce our panelists. We have Richard Watts standing by the screen here, who is going to serve as our moderator. He is the Executive Director of the UVM Center for Community News. We have Min Lee here. He is an assistant professor of political science and the author of the forthcoming book, Answering to Us, The Right to Democratic Accountability. Next to Min is Meg Little-Riley, Managing Director of the Center for Community News at UVM, and she is the author of the forthcoming book, Scapegoat Nation, Sex, Backlash, and American Insecurity. And next to Meg is Daisy Benson, our own librarian here at UVM and Interim Director of Information and Instruction Services. It's great to see such a good turnout. I'm looking forward to this, and I'll turn it over to Richard to kick us off.
Thank you, Dean Geffert. Yes, welcome everybody. So great to see so many people to talk about democracy and civil society and journalism. There's no question that now is the time when it has never mattered more. We have an amazing panel, and I'm just going to turn it over to them in 1 second, but just a couple of words. By the way, there's one seat there, and maybe one here. We do have a sign-up list, and we would like to pass that a little around because we'd love to capture the folks interested in this conversation. I'm the director of something called the Center for Research on Vermont, and tonight and tomorrow, Vermont exercises one of the oldest traditions of direct democracy that's happening anywhere in the world, where town officials say, we trust our citizens enough that we are saying they can make the decisions on the issues before them. Direct democracy. Vermont, of course, leads in many ways, and that leadership is probably never more needed than now when it comes to thinking about issues of democracy and journalism and civil society. Vermont often ranks near the top on civic indexes like percent of people who volunteer, percent of folks involved in government, trust in institutions, And Vermont, over time, has led in many ways. In Vermont, we were the first state to provide universal health care to kids from 0 to 18. The concept of civil union, which is now marriage equality, was invented in a committee room in the State House. And of course, yesterday in Vermont, a 25-year-old snow reporter at Sugarbush called out the Vice President of the United States in her snow report. And if you haven't listened to it, listen to it. Anyway, there's never probably been a time when what we do matters more, and you're going to hear from these folks all about the various ways that we think about these issues today. So I'm going to turn it, we're going to go in this order: Daisy, Meg, Min, and then lots and lots of time for questions and your comments as we have this conversation. And I do want to thank the Dean and Kate and Sam, wherever he is, for putting this together and doing all the work to bring all you guys here together. All right, so without further ado, Daisy, take it away, and thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming, everyone. My name is Daisy Benson. I'm a librarian here at Howe Library. As the dean said, I'm the interim director of information and instruction, but my day job is I'm the library instruction coordinator and a liaison to a number of departments in the humanities and social sciences, which means I spend. Okay, how's this? Better? Closer? Sorry, it keeps moving because of the cord.
Democracy starts with being over here.
Yeah, how's this? Okay. So anyway, I'm a librarian. I do a lot of work with students. It's grounding a lot of where I'm coming from today. But as we gather here today, on the eve of town meeting day, I want to talk a little bit about democracy in the press. I'm reminded that as I moved here from Texas over 20 years ago, I didn't know much about Vermont. I remember being surprised at how easy it was to register to vote. One quick trip to the DMV and I had my new driver's license and was registered to vote. As a new resident, I dutifully subscribed to the Burlington Free Press and listened to VPR, knowing that as a librarian I would need to keep up with local news. You just never know what you're going to be asked by someone looking for research help. As a new Vermonter, I did not understand what town meeting was. I was living in Winooski, and I admit that while I was in that town, I never went to town meeting. I was a very bad Vermonter at the time. When I moved to Essex Junction, a colleague took me under her wing and invited me to join her family at the community supper and go to town meeting with her. Seeing the community talk through issues, everything from sidewalk plowing to school budgets, was fascinating and educational. At this point in time, these issues were all decided at the meeting in Essex by a voice vote at the meeting. This slow government in action was something new to me. I marvel at the work of town moderators and am grateful to have learned the workings of Robert's Rules of Order and having civil discourse in a meeting. My knowledge of them has helped me participate in shared governance in multiple contexts. When I moved to Essex Junction, another thing happened. The Essex Reporter started showing up on my doorstep once a week. This ultra-local paper proved invaluable for keeping up with the issues in my new community. Many of these smaller papers are now only online, but they benefit from the work of our colleagues in the Center for Community News. As a librarian at UVM, one of my jobs is to make sure that students have access and can effectively evaluate and use information sources, including the news. This work is of value not just as a means of helping students to complete assignments, but to help them develop as critical thinkers, members of their communities, and participants in democracy. Robust participatory democracy and free press go hand in hand. Nationally, we're seeing the emergence of large news deserts, attacks on the press and journalists by government officials, and pressure put on journalists by corporate owners. Here in Vermont, we are incredibly lucky to have a robust news ecosystem that includes a wide range of types of news outlets, including many nonprofit ventures. I look forward to our discussion today.
Daisy, thank you. I'm Meg Little Riley. I work with Richard at the Center for Community News. And I come to this discussion from kind of both sides of the journalistic and civic side. I started as a journalist in public media and ultimately worked as a communicator in the Obama administration, first in the Treasury Department and then the White House OMB. So I have both reported on issues of consequence to our communities, but also I've been on this side of having to confront a rigorous, critical press pool that's demanding answers on behalf of the public. And both of those experiences have strengthened my absolute sureness that without this ingredient, democracies don't work. And local news in particular serves a special function. It always does, but something interesting is happening right now as access by national reporters, I think, is kind of changing. There are new ways that we should probably talk in our discussion about the importance of local news too. When local news is good, it's basically doing three really important things. It is holding powerful people and institutions to account. It is establishing a baseline of verifiable truths, the things that happened at a particular time in a particular way. And it's cultivating a sense of place and identity. And those things are all really of equal importance. The third one can feel a little bit more like the softer science, right? Like what's going on what's the arts calendar say, and what do the obituaries say about the people in your community who lived here? But they are absolutely as essential for maintaining a sense of humanity for our neighbors, even when we really disagree with them. And some of the things that we know local news does is just the sheer presence of it. It is correlated with higher voter turnout. It's correlated with more civic engagement, with a fonder sense of your own community and your neighbors. It's even correlated with things like municipal borrowing costs, right? Which is actually pretty logical, you think about it, because it means that when you're holding institutions to account, the public is just keeping a closer eye on the decisions that are being made on your behalf, essentially. And so there's less recklessness by local officials, say. And I don't want to be romantic about local news. It can be bad if you try hard, but the sort of essential ingredients of it do act as a kind of bulwark against some of the polarization that happens at the national level. And the reason for that is that it is just kind of designed to do pragmatism a little bit better. National politics, if you turn on like CNN or whatever, MSNBC, anything at all, you look at the New York Times, there's a lot more of the kind of abstract politics there, which lend themselves to our political affiliations and all of the things that kind of like activate our political and philosophical allegiances. Local news is just good at talking about like how the plows get funded and who's going to fill the potholes and how many teachers will be in your local school. And for all of those reasons, this is not an argument for centrism. It's an argument for the proximity of local news, which is just that it's generally reporting on the things that matter in your life in a kind of immediate way. And that's a good thing. One of the reasons that we know that local news is correlated with all those things is because most of the academic research on this stuff, it studies places where like the last substantial newspaper disappeared. And then those things change. And what happens with our media diets generally is that if your local newspaper goes away, and that's what you were reading, you're probably going to shift to a national media diet more than finding one that's like 40 miles down the road. And all of those kind of national news sources tend to be a little bit more polarizing, which isn't to say that like we don't all consume them, and they also serve a really important function. It's just that when that's all we have, there's a lot less of a connection to where we happen to be. And I keep saying newspapers, but first of all, we're like platform agnostic where we are. I know that most people in this room are not picking up newspapers. It really doesn't matter. Like there's nothing magic about this particular platform. If you wake up in the morning and read VC Digger or the New York Times or whatever it happens to be online exclusively, you're still getting great information. we're all going to have to keep thinking about how to follow the public, our media consumption habits, to like make sure information is going to the places where people are seeking it out. So when we talk about, we're not really like interested in like saving news the way it used to be. That seems like kind of a stupid idea. We're just interested in making sure that people are getting accurate information about the world at large and the neighborhoods that they live in whatever way they can find it. And one of the reasons that it does matter that you're getting it from a news outlet, forget about whether it's like a legacy news outlet or a brand new one or just an individual. You just want to make sure you're getting it from a source that is credible and that has established itself as, it has to have a fealty to some ethics, some core ethics of veracity and truth. And this is one of the things that differentiates the different kinds of sources of information out there. So I'm kind of using it as a shorthand, but the truth is, like, whether it's just an individual that you trust in the world, we know that citizen journalism is super important. If you happen to be in a place like Gaza right now, an individual who has been providing accurate information with a camera might be the only thing that the world has access to, and that's super important too. So wherever it's kind of coming from, I'm not placing any value on that at all. So I think the last point that I'm going to make about all of this is simply that there are all these sort of interesting things happening at the national level with this administration has obviously expelled the Associated Press and Reuters from the press bowl at the White House, and it sounds like also probably the State Department, Defense Department, where they also have embedded press pools. And that is very remote when you think about like the proximity to our own lives, except that it may be the case that as the sort of eyes and ears of the public are no longer watching some of the people in power in Washington, we are more reliant on the ways that local news reporters can explain to us how national policies are being implemented close to our lives, what are the consequences for all of us and our communities. Certainly at this university, universities have a lot at stake at what's going on in the world right now. So I would argue that it has actually never mattered more. I know this is like a lot of hyperbole, but like now more than ever, it actually really matters a lot that there are people going to the places reporting on the things that happen. And statistically, probably 65% of the people in this room get most of their news by watching TikTok, people commenting on things that they saw. But like the thing is, all of those TikTok videos probably
Wonder if someone has the mobile mic that Bryn was using? I'm so used to standing in front of my students like this. So thank you so much for coming to our talk here at the University of Vermont.
Just come this way a little bit.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for coming to our talk here at the University of Vermont. So I want to talk today about the role of a free press and local newspapers in our democracy. And our agenda is to explain this vital role of freedom of the press for democratic accountability and see how a vibrant local press is essential for democracy. This is a picture of Matthew Lyon. He was a Vermont representative in the late 18th century, around 1798 to 1800. He has the distinction of being the only congressional representative to ever run for office from prison and to be reelected. So that's our Vermont representative. And you might say, what was he in prison for? Was it possession of marijuana? But it wasn't, because that was not criminalized in Vermont until 1915 and legalized in 2018. But he was actually in prison for violating the Sedition Act of 1798. It was a law signed into law by President John Adams that criminalized criticism of the government. And so what happened was that he was the first person prosecuted under the Sedition Act of 1798 14 newspaper editors were indicted by John Adams and his attorney general. And he accused Adams of, quote, ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. I think that's a bad thing, but pretty mild by our contemporary standards. But it tells you that history rhymes, because now freedom of the press is under attack. And interestingly, the Sedition Act was paired with the Alien Act, which gave President Adams the power to deport any non-citizen without a trial, something that we're seeing today. And it was because a lot of people who were immigrants in the United States were supporting the Democratic Republicans, which was the opposition party to President Adams, who was a Federalist, that they were weaponizing immigration and shutting down freedom of the press in order to support President Adams. So who was the resistance? Well, the nucleus of the resistance were two familiar figures, Thomas Jefferson, who later served as our third president, as well as James Madison, our fourth president, and also the primary architect of the Constitution. And James Madison said something really striking. He said the Sedition Act would destroy our free system of government. And why is freedom of the press so important? Well, let me point out three reasons that he talks about in his report on the resolutions from 1800. First of all, freedom of the press enables us to exercise our right to vote by comparing the candidates for office. If we didn't have any information about the candidates running for office, we couldn't decide how to vote. Certainly if the election were slanted, so we were only hearing from the incumbent but not from his or her challengers, our right to vote would be curtailed. Secondly of all, and I think Meg talked about this before, and so did Daisy, freedom of the press holds our government accountable by criticizing its injustices. So Madison talks about using the opprobrium, that is the naming and shaming of public criticism, to hold our public leaders to account. So think of the tidal wave of criticism that followed President Nixon and his attempt to warp our system of justice during the Watergate scandal. And then thirdly, James Madison says that freedom of the press is, quote, the only effectual guardian of every other right. So it's pivotal for instrumentally protecting our other rights from being violated by government abuses. And Winston Churchill takes up this theme later in a famous quote where he says that freedom of the press, quote, is the unsleeping guardian of every other right that free men prize. It is the most dangerous foe of tyranny. That's from Winston Churchill, and he's, I think, taking up this theme from James Madison. So, what's the problem from democracy that we're facing today? It's that they're expanding news deserts. So since 2005, 1 in 3 of the nation's newspapers has closed. And in fact, in just the last year, in 2024, 127 newspapers have closed. That's how rapid we're seeing closures of newspapers. And then what this means is that 2 in 3 counties in the United States is lacking a local newspaper. So how are they going to find out about abuses in local government? How are they going to find out what their local government is doing in terms of the laws and ordinances they're passing? And now 55 million Americans out of 330 million Americans are without local news. So these newspaper closures end up polarizing voting, according to studies by Darhead and Dunaway. And then secondly, without local newspapers, citizens pay less attention to local politics. So what we're seeing here is similar to what Meg said, that people shift their attention over to national news. They're seeing what's happening in Washington, D.C., but maybe not what's happening in Montpelier, maybe not what's happening in Trenton, New Jersey. So that's very problematic because people are being less informed about what's happening in state and local politics, or focusing excessively on national news, and they're also polarizing more sharply into 2 different camps, into Republicans versus Democrats versus being more moderate. And what's the importance of news investigations? Well, let's look at the vital issue of climate change, where Inside Climate News was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for reporting where they found out that Exxon, actually the oil company, knew about global warming all the way back almost 50 years ago in 1977. So this was actually 13 years before the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change revealed the existence of climate change. So if Exxon had revealed this information, we would have had a 13-year head start on fighting climate change. But Exxon suppressed this research. They actually spent millions of dollars sampling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They built a $1 million ship to sample carbon dioxide from the oceans. And they found out that, yes, global warming is a real thing. This is from an oil company. But they suppressed this research the way that cigarette companies suppress research about how tobacco causes lung cancer, emphysema, other pulmonary diseases. So Inside Climate News, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, found out about this through an investigative report. And he found out that Exxon actually uncovered evidence all the way back in 1977 that doubling the CO2 in the atmosphere would lead to a 2 to 3 degree Celsius increase in our global temperatures, which would have catastrophic impacts in terms of sea level rise and climate change. So what is the Center for Community News doing about this crisis with these expanding news deserts? Well, the Center for Community News is, students are reporting on local news here at the University of Vermont with the help of editors. And the goal is to, quote, build citizenship skills. So we're creating citizens who are being more informed and helping to inform our fellow citizens. And Richard is providing excellent leadership at the Center for Community News, and they just won a foundation. So incredible work that Richard is doing. And the UVM Center for Community News is now a national hub to build collaborations with other universities. So we're collaborating with multiple other universities. This is a map of all the news academic partnerships in the country between local universities and local news. And the Center for Community News is becoming a national hub for these academic news partnerships, including at Harvard with the Neiman and tomorrow for Town Meeting Day. We talked about what was the origin of the American Revolution. And he said that the American Revolution wasn't something that was just fought on a battlefield and in Lexington and conquered. This is what John Adams said in his letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1815, that, quote, "What do we mean by the revolution, the war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and a consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people. In the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was drawn in Lexington, the records of 13 legislatures, the pamphlets, the newspapers in all the colonies ought to be consulted to ascertain the steps by which the public opinion was enlightened and informed." So the very American Revolution was made possible because of 15 years of coverage in local newspapers that informed citizens. So we owe the birth of our country today, our birth of liberty, to local newspapers. So thank you, Richard, for all the work that you're doing, and thank you for coming to listen to our presentation.
Amazing, 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 amazing. Now, it's time for you all, if you have any questions or comments or thoughts, and thank you, Professor Lee, for putting in a plug for this thing that we're doing here at UVM. So for you students, if you ever want to try on reporting, you may not go on and do it, but if you just want to see what it's like to be curious about the world and get to write or produce things that people read and see, look us up. And Sam, raise your hand. Sam there can help you connect you with like funded internships and all sorts of things. All right, questions, comments, anybody on anything? Yeah, should we jump around or do you want to jump up and shout it out? Just say it out loud and I'll repeat it maybe. Yeah, but stand up and say your name if you would. Yeah, just like town meeting. We'll do it like town meeting. Brian.
Yeah, I have a question about the newspaper closures. Are they just closing the physical plants, or are they going from the press, the paper press, to just online, or are they not even going online? And are these paper closures, are they mainly being closed down by corporate parents, or are they also independent papers closing too?
So many good questions there. Are the papers closing? Is there something stepping up to replace them? Are there people who are buying them? They're Meg.
I think the statistics you were citing are the same ones that we use, which come from the Medill research on this, and they are about the end of the newspaper entirely. So regardless of whether it's not just the end, the stop printing, it is also the closure of the actual newsroom. And to your point, there is another category. So sometimes independent newspapers close, of course. Sometimes hedge funds buy newspapers and they eventually shut them down because they're not profitable. But there's this other sort of in-between stage where something like a hedge fund buys them and they just kind of hollow them out and they have hardly any reporters left. And those are ghost papers, zombie papers. There's a couple different terms for it. But it sort of looks like there's a newspaper in your community, but it's not really telling you anything about what's going on. That kind of newspaper only happens when basically like an investor entity owns a paper. It never happens to private owners.
And I want to add to that that a main problem with newspaper closures is that newspapers used to have two prominent sources of income. One was paid subscribers, and the second was advertisers. And the two worked hand in hand together, because if an advertiser knew that a newspaper reached out millions of people, they would have an incentive to place their advertisements in the newspapers. But then the two are being simultaneously undermined by the internet, because people are getting increasingly used to paying for, not paying for news, reading it for free. So a lot of internet service companies, they will actually repost articles that without paying for them. So it's kind of pirating the news. So you're seeing a decline in paid subscribers, number one. And number two, you're also seeing a decline in advertisement, because a lot of companies, instead of advertising in a local newspaper, they will advertise instead on Google or Facebook, because they know that they can reach more eyeballs through that than through a local newspaper. So because with local newspapers, their two chief sources of funding are being cut off, that's why 1 in 3 newspapers have been closing since 2005.
Thank you. Right next to you, Brian, somebody else had a question over here? Yeah. Can you stand up and shout out your name? Yeah. Yeah.
So my question is, how do we as a community kind of form a cohesive bond in kind of allowing ourselves to be these vessels to push out community outreach and that helps people who may be polarized to that far side of the nation and bring them back, so that way we can, you know, talk about both sides rather than having this trend where we have one side maybe, like you said, news designated somewhere, we can encourage people to come and vote for whatever they believe in and have talks about how we can come together as a community and vote for things that maybe support all of our interests rather than just one side.
Okay, so I'll just repeat a little bit of it, because it relates directly to what our panelists talk about. Is there something because we're about journalism, is there something about journalism or in what you're talking about today that can provide a better sense of community so people can make decisions together that are in the overall good? Daisy, do you want to say anything? And then we'll go Meg, Min.
Sure. I think that local papers, and again, I'm using the word paper generously, format agnostic. Local news has that ability, right? It's about the things, like Meg was saying, that are happening in your daily life. What's going on in the schools, right? What are kids learning or not? What are we funding there? What's the conversation going on in the community about free school lunches, right? All the stuff that affects individuals, their households, the people they care about. And that tends to be, when we look at a national paper, right, there's no sense of like just everyday people going about their lives and trying to make sure they're doing this. But when it's the local level, not only is it your community, but the people that they're talking to and providing photographs of are likely to be your neighbors, right? They're people that you know. And when you know that you're going to be in a situation to talk about funding those things, and particularly somewhere in Vermont where that community, like the distance between what's happening and the democracy in Vermont is a pretty short distance, right? We have an unprecedented access to the people who are making decisions in our communities at the local and state level in Vermont, much better than in most other places. And that enables the press and to direct and bring things up that have real meaning for people, right? And I think a lot of it is drawing people in for the small things that matter, which are the things that when people talk often about what they care about, even in a national election, like, you know, I care about the price of eggs, right, is the example people have been talking about in the last few weeks. That's a pretty local issue in a lot of ways, right? That's like, what's really happening? How am I buying food, right? But it's a different conversation when it's at the local level, I think.
I'll just add that your question, which is a lovely one, speaks to the importance of having a generation of reporters and editors and and producers and who actually look like the community, who look
Yeah.
like this country. There historically, news reporting has been has started with a frame that used the perspective of people in power, politicians, institutions, things like that. And it actually didn't usually start with the perspective of the communities affected. It swooped into certain neighborhoods and only covered crime. It covered marginalized communities as these kind of like as this sort of in anthropological ways rather than actually as being of our neighborhoods and communities. So the point is, when the reporters in newspapers and radio and television look like this place that we live, the stories are better and they have more humanity to them and more sincere curiosity about our experiences, I think.
I would add to that there was a research team out of Texas A&M, Louisiana State University that found that when local news outlets close, people become more polarized. So the question from Sean was asking us, how can we make our communities less polarized? Well, one opportunity is to support our local newspapers. And there was actually an act introduced to Congress, to both the House and the Senate, in 2021 called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. Although it didn't move beyond committee, what it proposed to do was to give each American citizen a $250 voucher to spend on a local newspaper, to subscribe to local newspapers. So that's one way we could support local newspapers if this act were passed. A second thing it proposed to do was to give newspaper companies a tax break on their payroll taxes for each journalist they hired. A statistic I didn't mention in my presentation was that if you look at the last 20 years, the number of journalists in the country has decreased from 71,000 to 35,000. So this act would make it much more affordable to hire journalists by defraying the cost of hiring a journalist through a federal tax incentive. And thirdly, what it would incentivize people to do is to also provide direct tax breaks for local newspapers. So something like that I think would be very helpful for local newspapers. And if that sounds implausible, think of the example of the European Union. The European Union spends 1.3 billion euros every year supporting newspapers. Italy spends 10 million euros every year supporting local newspapers. So if local newspapers are providing a public good in terms of making the public more informed and less polarized when it comes to local issues, and if they're becoming increasingly sustainable because of competition from Google and Facebook and Twitter, then we need to have public dollars backing this public good to provide the public good of local news.
Thank you. Others, let's take a few more. Yes, and if you're willing, in the back, we'll start in the back, then come to you, okay? If you can, and I'm gonna just, for time, not everybody, yeah, okay. Please.
My name is Lois Price, and I'm concerned when I hear the president say that he is going to handpick the reporters who cover the White House.
Yeah.
Which he has recently said. Is there anything that we can do about that to prevent that from happening?
Right.
Because then our flow from the White House of information will be inaccurate and biased.
All right, so just to repeat, you probably heard that, but Lois Bryce asks, can the president really hand select the reporters that cover the White House? Meg worked in the White House. I don't know. Do you have any idea?
Well, so the way it works is that the pool of reporters there is an actual room in the White House where the president goes and addresses the public, or more often it's the press secretary of the president. And that pool of reporters is loosely decided by the National Press Association, which has been trying to be more inclusive and having more kinds of different partisan outlets and more platforms. They're actually doing their best to do that all the time. But the president ultimately can decide to expel anybody he wants and let anybody in. He's already doing it. This is what they do it in the Kremlin. It is, I think, one of the most alarming things happening right now. But let me say this. So what we can do, limited. But what the news outlets that we consume and pay for can do is a lot. When I worked in the Treasury Department, in the first term of the Obama administration, Fox News committed some infraction that I can't even remember. I'm sure it would seem very quaint today. And the Obama administration decided that it wanted to keep Fox News out for like 2 weeks. It was going to be like a probationary period because they told a lie or something. And all the other reporters who were in the White House press pool, none of whom I would say are probably close fans of Fox News, banded together, came back to the White House and said, don't do it. If you want any of us to cover the White House, you may not do this to them. It's a dangerous precedent. Why they're not doing that today, I cannot answer, because that's what they could do. Now, there is a fear that if all of the problem is that they wouldn't have unity, right? Like half of the sort of like old news organizations, the press corps would say, we're all going to band together and boycott covering your next event. But the other half would be these hand-selected, kind of propaganda outlets, and it wouldn't matter. Like, it's possible that this White House this would just expedite their plans. So I guess that's why, but they have power and they're not using it.
Stay tuned. Let's keep going, and then we'll keep, yes.
I was wondering whether or not you think that the local newspapers closing and therefore the citizens having to rely on national news could be seen as like a tactic to keep people feeling like they don't have as much control, since the only thing that they're reading is something that is a lot less personal to them when they have the opportunity to be personalized in their politics.
Wow. And Min, do you want to start that one, and you can finish whatever?
Repeat it just so
Sure. Is there anything, can you say your name?
Autumn.
Autumn. A student of yours, Min?
I think so, yes. An intro, right? Introduction to Political Theory. Thank you for coming.
Do you want to say the question for?
So Autumn was saying, is this tactic of closing newspapers a deliberate tactic in order to undermine democratic accountability, to disempower people, to make people feel like their ability to participate is futile? So I would say that part of the closures are just a result of market forces, because a lot of this money is shifting to the big tech giants. So, but certainly powerful people are benefiting from local news shutting than people being less informed about politics. So there was the second study that I mentioned, which showed when local news outlets close, people become a lot less informed about their local politics. There was an infamous case where a local newspaper closed, and the result was that the city council voted these enormous pay raises for themselves. So the city council members then got like a $100,000 pay raise, and then the city manager got an $800,000 pay raise, and the police chief got a $650,000 pay raise. So there's the kind of abuses that happen when local news isn't present. So it absolutely disempowers people, and it's a part of what Aristotle talks about in the Politics when he talks about the techniques that tyrants use to stay in power. One is to make the people less informed. The second is to divide people against each other, going back to Sean, making people more polarized will make them easier to divide and rule, as Aristotle says. And the third technique is to attack universities, to attack places of higher education where people can learn the skills to participate politically and the skills to cooperate with each other. And that's what we're seeing with people like the vice president saying that professors are the enemy, universities are the enemy. It's a page right out of Aristotle's Politics that he warned us about.
Okay. Any more questions or comments? Yeah. And go ahead, shout it out.
My name's Carter. Rather than giving government subsidies to smaller news organizations, do you think it would benefit these smaller news organizations to kind of go after and attack the large news conglomerates that kind of control a lot of the press right now?
Daisy, do you want to jump into that one?
No idea.
The dean is up front here, so.
Well, what I would say is, look at the model of iTunes. Like, back when the internet was taking off, there was a huge problem with the proliferation of the theft of copyrighted music. And of course, if that continued, the music industry would become bankrupt because singers and other entertainers wouldn't be paid for their work. And that's what we're seeing today with newspaper journalists. They're not being paid for the very painstaking work, expensive investigative work that they're doing. So one intervention we could have is that to enforce copyright law when it comes to the production of local news, so that if people are reposting news, they have to pay for it. And currently, Google and the other tech giants aren't doing it. So something that we could borrow from iTunes and that model is making sure that journalists are being paid for the work that they're doing instead of their work being stolen.
There's a possibility too that large news organizations can actually like handle lawsuits like that, and they could actually change policies that then create a kind of umbrella safety for the smaller ones. Large news organizations don't really consider local news organizations to be like their competitors. I don't see them as being at odds with one another as a general rule. Like, we've always had kind of a friendly exchange. If they wanted to be a force for good, that's what they could do, is they could create some shade for local news outlets to hide under right now. Places like, but this is the risk of having a benevolent billionaire as your owner, right? A place like the Washington Post won't do it now because Jeff Bezos isn't interested in doing it. Disney and its TV affiliates are already preemptively acquiescing. So who's left? I'm not sure. I wish I had a more optimistic tone to finish that one on,
But the one thing I would add, like, one of the powers that we all have is the power of our pocketbook, right? So you see what's happening with the Washington Post, for example. Lots and lots of people are canceling their subscriptions. What do you do with that money? You send it to Vermont Digger. You donate to Vermont Public. You donate for the Center for Community News. You help fund the local news that you want to see. Because most of them are operating as nonprofits, which doesn't mean that they don't need your support. So shifting where you're putting your money.
So we're going to go to about 5, so we have another 10 minutes or so. We'll start here and then, okay, you and then you and then you. Yeah.
Okay, hi, my name is Stephen Marshall. I'm a master candidate here. When I moved to Vermont in the mid-'80s, one of the things I noticed right away, which just really surprised me, was that the newspapers were actually talking about things that were interesting and important. I'd come from New York, and it was always car crashes and crime, but they never talked about what was happening in City Hall or in City Council. There was never anything about community development, so on and so forth. And I wonder if you'd like to try to explain that cultural difference.
Daisy, you started there, but
I think there really is something in Vermont about being small and slow that's very different than other media markets. I don't know how that can be cultivated to work in other places, but
and I'll just tell you one other thing. We have about 30 community papers in Vermont, and they're, by definition, they're focused on the local and hyper-local. And although we do have our few hedge funds, ownership from away that owns a couple of papers, still most of our smaller papers. So we still have some of that orientation towards the local, I think. Somewhere in the back. Yes, shout out your name, your question.
Hi, I'm Abby, and I was just wondering if, after this talk, thinking about just the drop in journalists being hired by local news organizations, journalists not being properly compensated for the work, the painstaking work that it takes to be a journalist. I was wondering what any advice you guys would give to young journalists that still really want to get into this work, but are feeling a little discouraged in terms of perseverance, and then also just with the current administration as well. It can feel very discouraging trying to get into media and press. So thank you.
Richard, I think you should answer that one. There's so much to be excited about right now, actually.
Thank you, Abby. Are you a reporter now? So Abby asked, as a young journalist, what is there to be hopeful about as we hear about all these? Yeah. Are you a reporter now?
I'm just a court reporter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, lots of people, like you heard from the panelists, are so concerned about what's happening with local news that there's all sorts of new ways of thinking about funding it and saving it and preserving it that are happening. You heard some of them, and there are more. One of them is universities having a bigger role. So you can practice the journalists with us, but universities are going beyond that and actually standing up media partners. We have started something in Winooski called the Winooski News, for example. We helped start something in Waterbury, as we should with the resources that we have at universities. But there's these nonprofit models emerging. There are lots of entry-level jobs. We have a couple of reporters over here who might be able to answer this question. But it's the medium level and the higher level jobs and the higher pay and moving up. So lots of us think about it all the time. Don't give up, we need you.
The Report for America, there's also a movement to help change legislation in states, like the kinds of things that Professor Lee was talking about. We have some legislation that might be in development here in Vermont that we have been helping to inform on the way. So there really are a lot of opportunities for people who want to get involved, and but stay open to being surprised. Don't get attached to a particular kind of platform or a particular one of the things that I think is challenging that we hear over and over is that younger news reporters also kind of have to be they have to know how to do social media production, and they have to know how to stand in front of a camera, even if they're print reporters. And so I think there are more demands in that way to be a kind of an expert in everything. But there's a lot to be excited about, and everyone is charged up right now.
Yeah, we're going to take just a few more. Bryn, did you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I'm wondering whether you believe local news can be fully revived without news consumers becoming accustomed again to purchasing and paying for news.
Can local news, be revived in new models that don't rely on the Min?
I think it would be very difficult because who would be funding the newspapers? Well, some of the shortfall can be taken up by government funding as it is in the European Union. But if there's no market at all for local news, then it would be very difficult to revive local news. So part of it is having an educated citizenry that is demanding local news. And that's, I think, one of the tasks of civic education. And I'm involved in an Alliance for Civics in the Academy, where University of Vermont is partnering with several other universities, including Harvard, Princeton, University of Florida, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, to try to revive civic education at the university level. And there's now a movement, too, to try to revive civics in the K through 12 level. So Massachusetts, for example, is reviving its civics requirement under the work of my friend Peter Levin at Tufts University.
Daisy, anything to add? All right, more. Ms. Finn, introduce yourself.
I'm a neighbor of Richard's. That's how he happens to know my name. But how many local newspapers across the country are still publishing? And if they are publishing, are they charging money to the local inhabitants in this? I grew up in a small town in Illinois, and my family was a newspaper family, from my great-grandfather to my grandfather to my father. And we published twice a day, morning edition and evening edition. And it was a town of 15,000 people. And it totally depended on all that information. And it was bought out by a very large newspaper organization out of Canada when, in the 50s. So that went by the wayside. But you all have so much competition now for where you get your news. When I grew up, there was no competition. You either got the local newspaper or listened to the radio, and that was it. Or listened to the gossiper next door. I mean, whichever. But it's amazing to me how far information media has come and how demanding it is, because there's so much chatter and chaos, and sorting through that is very, very, very difficult. I find it difficult, but I'm in my 80s, so but I wish you all good luck, because this is going to save America if we can actually get appropriate and factual information out to all our citizens. It's very scary to me, but this will be your future.
Okay.
And so I'm glad you're all here to listen to this.
All right, I'm going to try and...
Sorry, Richard, I'm sorry.
Ms. Finn grew up in a newspaper family, part of a newspaper empire, and she wonders, she wonders where, with the amazing amount of information and what is local news? How can we actually move forward? Daisy is going to answer this.
So one thing that occurs to me is, I was talking before about, okay, when you cancel your subscription to the Washington Post, put that into local things. The other thing is to think about where you're spending your media dollars, right? And in particular, where you're spending your dollars for news information. And remember that you are at a university. You have access to information that the university is providing for you. UVM has a huge collection of newspapers. We have print newspapers, we have online newspapers. A lot of our online newspapers are from aggregated sources, so they're not as pretty as reading a print newspaper or going straight to the New York Times site. But we have the content from newspapers from around the country and around the world. So do your local public libraries. And if you depend on getting a large amount of your newspaper's content and news information from your library, you can then spend the media dollars that you want to spend close to home and in the things that need your support, rather than paying into the things that are already doing just fine.
Last words from each of our panelists, and we'll wrap up, and then know that we're all going to be here and there's refreshments. Meg, some final thoughts?
Yeah, it's not all doom. There are a lot of opportunities right now. It is true that nobody's publishing twice a day, but there are also a lot of benefits to not having a media monoculture anymore. There's so many more voices. There's no barrier to entry, which is part of why it's also the Wild West, and there's just tons and tons of garbage, but there's also so much great stuff. And there is no final destination here. News and media are in a perpetual state of change, and this is going to keep being true forever and ever. I don't think this isn't the final chapter on the news industry. People need reliable information. This may be the moment when everyone falls back in love with reputable sources for information.
I'll conclude with the thought that you need to politically organize. So if you want to press for public funding for newspapers or other interventions that can help support local journalism, that would be fantastic. And I want to close with the words of Edmund Burke, the famous English-Irish political theorist and statesman, in his thoughts on the present discontents in 1780, which he published when the King of England was infringing upon the rights and the powers of Parliament. And he said that when bad men combine, the good must associate, else the rest of us will fall one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle. So what's important is that one by one, in a solitary way, we can be, we're very vulnerable. But if we work together, if we politically organize, we can turn things around. And I have confidence in the future because I know young people, and remember James Madison was only 25 years old during the American Revolution. I've been really impressed by the young people I've met. I know that you're going to do a fantastic job and a much better job than the prior generation, so thank you.
I just want to also appreciate the library, Kate, and the dean, and Sam for his help. And then stick around, there are a few refreshments if you want to talk more about any of this. And then a final big thank you to our amazing panel.